Now, let's take a closer look on the situation of refugees and asylum seekers. There is much indication that social support has a moderating role in this respect. So social support can alleviate post-traumatic and acculturative stress. And social support can either be granted by the ethnic group or by the host population. I did research on both, and both studies revealed positive results, either with ethnic self-help groups or with sponsorship projects, coaching by the native population for the asylum seekers and refugees population. There is also a positive influence of family unification and marriage. But there are special difficulties for people who find no ethnic community in the receiving country. So let's say if somebody is coming from what country could it be? A very small country, far away. Let's say some small African country. Like Ivory Coast. If someone comes from Ivory Coast to Vienna, he or she will find it very hard to find other people from Ivory Coast. It will be much easier for someone coming from Afghanistan. So if there is no ethnic community in the receiving country, of course there is also lack of social support. For all of us, it can be extremely important to exchange in our mother tongue, especially if we have no command of the host country's language. Would be no problem for an English-speaking European to go to the USA and communicate there in English. But if you do not speak the host country's language and you cannot speak your own language, that will be extremely stressful. So people have a need to communicate in their mother tongue. But even if the host country's language is spoken well, emotional issues are still hardly to communicate in a foreign language. So if you are really concerned by a matter, you will communicate it in your mother tongue. Of course, there are special groups of concern among refugees and asylum seekers, unaccompanied children and youth. There have been good results obtained from foster families of the receiving country, especially if these foster families belong to the same ethnic group as the children and young people. For adults, there are often problems with unemployment, and it is very well known that long-time unemployment has negative effects on self-esteem, not only in refugees, in all people, of course. And young people often suffer from role conflicts between the cultures because the peers and their family of origin often adhere to different values. The family of origin rather to conservative values, and the peers rather to modern values. And this can produce much conflict, especially role conflict between the two cultures. Now, let's go to chapter 2, and let me give you some data. This is a statistic by the European Union which shows you the number of immigrants, not necessarily refugees, immigrants, per 1,000 inhabitants in the year of 2013. And you see, of course, there are large differences, and not all the countries can be compared. At the left end of the graph, for example, you see Luxembourg Cyprus and Malta, which are very small places, and of course there is a very high rate of immigrants. In Luxembourg it is about 35 or 36 per 1,000, but these are very special situations. But for example, if you consult the graph in Austria, it's about 12, it's about the same in Ireland, the United Kingdom about 8, Slovenia about 7, Spain about 7, Italy, Finland, Poland about 6 to 7, Hungary 3, Germany it's about 7, and Slovakia is about 1 or 2. This is about educational attainment. It's the wrong way around on this slide. I did not make this graph. The lowest group is up and the highest group is on the bottom. So the pink part is low educational attainment, blue is medium and yellow is high. And the left 3 bears are the native borns and the right 3 bears are the foreign borns. And so you can see very readily that among the foreign borns there is the highest amount of low education. This is the unemployment rate. On the x-axis there are the native borns and on the y-axis there are the foreign borns in various countries. You have Estonia on the right upper end, and you have, for example, Switzerland, Norway and Netherlands on the left lower end. But you see that the foreign borns in almost all the countries are disadvantaged, and there is higher unemployment among the foreign borns than among the native borns. This is the age structure. Considering both foreign borns and native borns. And the graph shows you quite clearly that the age structure is a much more favorable one among immigrants, because immigrants usually have more children than native borns. So this is very important for paying future pensions, for also because of the need of economics for working people, but also customers. So if the society gets older and older, it will be impossible to finance pensions, and economy will deteriorate because there are not enough workers and not enough customers. So it is very, very important for a country to have a stable population, not a decrease in population, especially not a decrease with younger people. This slide is about the demographic pressure for example, in Slovakia, but not only in Slovakia, of course. Of course, these are estimates, and the red bears are with migration, and the yellow bears are without migration. Starting from 2010 and going to 2060. And you see, without migration, the trend will be even worse as compared to the version with migration. And you have the same statistics also for the European 27 countries. It's the blue line, and you see it's about the same for the EU 27. So there's a negative trend in the demographic statistics, and therefore, without migration, the countries would run into severe economic problems. Therefore, we need migrants. This is an example about the development of migration, especially of asylum seekers over the past years in Austria. And as you know, there has been a very dramatic development last year. These are on the x-axis, you see the 12 months of the year, and you have the lines for 2011, 2012, 2013, nothing new in fact, but in 2014, already in the second part of the year, you see that the numbers were rising. And then you have the red graph for the year of 2015. So the year started with about 4,000, then you had a slight decrease during the winter months, and then a dramatic increase till the end of the year. The next slide is about asylum applications in Austria by country of origin. In fact, this is an interactive graph which can be clicked on, but our time is very limited, and so I won't do it. This graph is for Austria, and you see that during the years between 2006 and 2012, asylum applications went back dramatically, and then 2013 we got more of them again. And you also see from the colors that the countries of origin differed considerably from one year to the other, which does not come as a surprise, because this of course depends on the political situation in the respective countries. For example, to name only one example, there is the blue field, quite high in this graph. This is for Afghanistan, and you see that there were high numbers of Afghan asylum seekers in the years of 2005, 2006, 2010, 2012, but then they went back and got more again in 2013 and 2014. So this is a very interesting graph, and if you, of course, you can obtain the slides from us, and if you have the slide, you might just go to the internet and look at this graph yourself in the interactive way. So we go on now with some theoretical considerations about acculturation. You know the statistics now, at least in some raw form. Of course, one could talk about that much longer, but we won't do that. We will rather look at some theoretical considerations related to acculturation. First of all, there is the important distinction between individualism and collectivism. This distinction does not deal with migration, does not have to do with the refugee question, but it has to do with cultures. The first slide just gives you some literature. If you are interested in that, you might especially also consult Mr. Hofstede's website, which is full of interesting statistics in this respect. What is this all about? Individualism and collectivism goes back to a historical concept by the German philosopher Tönnies, who differentiated community from society. Community resembles the individualist part, and society resembles the collectivist part of the world. So what is this? Community refers to a type of culture where single persons feel as parts of the whole clan, village, extended family, and so on. So they do not identify with themselves, they identify with their group of origin to which they belong. A common purpose, so a leader exists. There is emphasis on values like reverence and dignity. The community is founded by kinship, so by being born as a member of a certain extended family, by common dwelling and friendships. In short, in community, the visible connections prevail. This is opposed to society or individualism. Tönnies, who started off as a communist, but then he was also a friend of Karl Marx, but later on he departed from him. But Tönnies in that phase put it this way. He said, in society, some persons used to exploit others for their purposes. And there is individualization, industrialization, there are modern forms of state. In any case, for society, for the individualistic type, there are abstract connections instead of real connections between the people. There are contracts, organizations, companies, there is the division of labor, there is capital, the intention of influential single people prevails over the majority. This may be opposed to the common good, Tönnies said. And values become subjective issues. So, this was the original differentiation of Gesellschaft and Gemeinschaft, and it was continued later by the concept of individualism, collectivism. And it also was continued by Schweder's cultural psychology. So, after giving you this short introduction into individualism versus collectivism, you may imagine the differences. What is the collectivist part of the world? Collectivism, in fact, starts in Southern Europe. Think of former Yugoslavia, think of Greece, Turkey, and so on. And of course, the whole Arab world is collectivist, and whole sub-Saharan Africa is collectivist, and also Asia, including Japan, is collectivist. South America is collectivist. But North America and the EU are the main examples of individualist cultures. And of course, also in our culture there are differences. For example, rural people tend to, also today, tend to be more collectivist than urban people. And 100 years ago, also Central Europe still was more collectivist than today, but the change started off in the Middle Ages. From the Middle Ages on, when urbanization took place, individualism got stronger and stronger, and collectivism went back in Europe. But now, considering all this, think of the psychological situation of a person coming from a collectivist culture, from an Arab country, for example, or from Iran, or from South Africa, or Central Africa, or West Africa, Nigeria, coming to a perfectly individualist culture like Slovakia, Austria, or Germany. It's an entirely different cultural situation these persons have to adapt to. And this is why in the next sub-chapter we are going to discuss acculturative stress quite shortly. This concept, initiated by John Barry, was inspired by Lazarus' transactional model of stress, which you certainly know. The transactional model of stress pertains to the fact that stress is not a given thing, but stress is moderated by cognitions. The stress reaction depends on the evaluation of the situation, either as a menace or as a chance, as a challenge. This is the most important difference. And there is also a second evaluation about the possibilities to manage a stressful situation. Do I believe that I will be efficient enough to deal with the situation? These are the two evaluations, the two cognitive processes, which are the main idea of the transactional stress model. And Berry adapted the transactional model of stress to the situation of asylum seekers and refugees. And he also differentiated between the working mechanisms on the societal or group level and on the personal level. All this can be examined either sociologically on the societal level or psychologically on the personal level, the individual level. And of course, Berry especially emphasized the moderating effect of social support as well as individual differences. So Berry's model of acculturative stress is meant to explain the large individual differences in the stress reaction in the situation of migrants and especially of refugees. So what is to be considered on the societal level? First of all, there are cultural, economic, political conditions which put the framework on these people. As I said, there is the push or the pull motivation. Refugees and asylum seekers are pushed away from their country of origin, and working migrants are pulled by the country they go to. Of course, the pull motivation is much more positive than the push motivation, not surprisingly. Of course, on the societal level, also the situation of the host society has to be considered. The attitude of the host societies, people, for example, towards migration and migrants, whether there is much prejudice and so on. Some societies provide much social support to migrants, while others only convey mistrust and prejudice. Consider especially, as I said, the amount of ethnic support in the host country and demands by the ethnic community in the host culture. So mostly this will be positive, but in part at least it also can be stressful. If demands are being placed on the individual by the ethnic community in the host country. In addition, of course, there is a different amount of support by the host society, as I already mentioned, for the migrants, which also should be considered. On the individual level, there are different amounts of contact between ethnic and receiving cultures, which of course leads to a certain amount of difficulties, of strain, and of possible problems and conflict. There are individual demands to the individual in his or her course of acculturation, and on the individual in the course of acculturation. As I said, stressors are not something unchangeable, but stressors are being moderated by cognitive factors. So it is important to consider the individual's appraisal of stressors, whether acculturation goes along with the stress reaction, and possibly even clinical symptomatology, or in the more positive case, acculturation may be a simple learning process. Stress can be seen as an immediate response to a problematic event, and stress functions on the behavioral, cognitive, emotional, and physiological level. Stress can be accompanied by anxiety and depression. Coping reactions can help to avoid severe reactions to stress. Only slight stress response may indicate successful coping. As an outcome variable of the model, both psychological and socio-cultural adaptation is considered. Psychological adaptation means that there is well-being and no clinical symptoms and so on. And sociological or socio-cultural adaptation refers to the question whether the person is adapted to the expectations of host society, if the person is working efficiently, if the person is integrated into the host country's society in various respects. This is socio-cultural adaptation. The two are, of course, the two types of adaptation are correlated, but they are not identical. Somebody may feel perfectly well without being integrated socioculturally. And of course, also the opposite may be true. Something may be adapted psychologically quite poorly, may be unhappy, but may be adapted socioculturally perfectly. So not only in migrants, in every human being, the two aspects of adaptation must be differentiated, psychological and sociocultural adaptation. Of course, as a moderating factor, the situation before migration must be considered. It has been found that lower age and male gender make acculturation more easy. Consider also the status loss for persons who had a high societal status before migration. On the other hand, good educational level can be helpful. The reasons of migration should be considered: the command of the language of the host country, the cultural distance between the sending and the receiving society, and possible difficulties with large religious differences, for example, between Christianity and Islam, but also with respect to gender roles and child rearing. In the course of acculturation, the so-called contact discrepancy should be considered. What does that mean? Contact discrepancy is the case when someone desires contact to some other group but does not have it. So contact discrepancy means the difference between desired and achieved social contact. There is no contact discrepancy if there is a group I do not want to contact and I cannot contact. In that case, there is no contact discrepancy. But if I want to talk to you and you don't want to talk to me, I have contact discrepancy. And you can very well imagine that this is often the case in asylum seekers and refugees. They want to have contact with their host society, but they are rejected by their neighbors and so on. This is contact discrepancy. Of course, in the positive sense, as I already mentioned, social support by both cultures and its appraisal and use must be considered. But one should also keep in mind that accepting help can endanger self-esteem. So it's not an easy psychological situation. If someone receives help from strangers, he's indebted to them. And self-esteem may be endangered. But still, problems between the sending and the receiving culture may be expected in many cases, and the individual demands to the individual in the course of acculturation may differ. And also personal coping strategies and acculturation strategies may differ. The next slide shows you the model I just explained to you in total. So in the center you have acculturation experience, possible stressors on the cognitive control, problem appraisal, and a stress reaction with psychosomatic, psychological symptoms, anxiety and depression may result. And finally, all this leads to more or less psychological and sociocultural adaptation. And all that is moderated, first of all, on the group level on the left, by some factors from the society of origin, and by other factors from the society of settlement. All that was explained on the foregoing slides. And on the individual level, you have moderating factors prior to acculturation: age, gender, education, religion, health status, language, and so on. And you have moderating factors during acculturation, like contact discrepancy, social support, social attitudes, coping strategies, and so on. So this graph summarizes the foregoing slides in a, I think, quite expressive way. Now, finally, last 5 minutes before the break, I will give you some basic theoretical thoughts on acculturation and health. These are the berry boxes, very, very well known. There are 4 possibilities for migrants. They can either maintain or reject their own culture. And they can either participate in the host culture or refuse to participate in the host culture. A person who maintains his or her own culture and who participates in the host culture is practicing the strategy of integration. If the person adheres to his or her own culture, maintains own culture, but does not take part in the host country's culture, this is called separation. The opposite, participating in the host culture, but leaving one's own culture, is called assimilation. And participating in none, neither own culture nor host culture, is called marginalization. There is much empirical evidence that the integration strategy of acculturation yields best results with regard to health and psychosocial and also psychological adaptation and well-being. And it's also quite clear that marginalization yields the worst results. It can be expected that the results for separation and assimilation, so for the remaining 2 strategies, are ambiguous and depend on various moderator variables. The next slide gives you some literature in case you want to inform yourself in more detail. You might go to this literature, or you also might go to the BBC News Special website, which gives you a very good account on the present so-called Europe's migrant crisis. There's much talk about it, but little information. You see it from September last year, so it's outdated already, but it will be updated every few months, I'm quite sure. You might have a look at this if it interests you, and you might also look for more recent documentation by BBC. And you also might go to the website of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, the UNHCR, whom I already mentioned, can be Googled easily. You got lots and lots of statistics for every country in the world about asylum seekers coming from that country, but also about asylum seekers being received by that country. So if you are interested in detailed statistics of this kind, go to one of the websites of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. I want to present a previous study on self-help groups of Chechen asylum seekers in Austria and their health-related effects. Just if you think of the first part, in the morning I emphasized that social support is one of the most important moderating factors in the stress model. And of course, self-help groups are an important resource, giving people each other of social support, which is given to ethnic people by each other. And the third part will be about the different kind of social support. It will be social support of refugees by the Austrian native population, kind of coaching. So not sponsors for children, but sponsors for adults, coaching for adults. And also in this case, we measured health-related effects. And as far as the first part is concerned about the attitudes, of course attitudes and prejudice also have health-related effects on the group of people against, for example, someone is prejudiced. So this is quite clear. So all that is about health-related effects. Now, let me summarize the first study. As you might know from the media, there have been mixed reactions by the Austrian native population to the increase of numbers of asylum seekers in the year of 2015. You remember the graph I showed you in the morning. In October 2015, for example, over 100,000 demonstrated in Vienna demanding solidarity and humane treatment for the newly arrived asylum seekers. And there were also thousands of volunteers who offered their assistance. But on the other hand, there are also reports of increased anxiety among the native population. And to illustrate this, you just have to consider the rising numbers of Austrians buying weapons in an attempt to, quotes, defend themselves, quotes. So there are large differences in the reactions to the current development. Now the question is, what makes the difference? How can these differences be explained psychologically and sociologically? We derived hypotheses from theoretical considerations which are explained in more detail in the literature. We will not go into this detail now, but just discuss first of all possible structural factors. One point is that asylum seekers are seen as ready scapegoats for poor economic situation in the host country. Now, the funny thing is that the economic situation in Austria and Germany is very good, and so there is no need for scapegoats. But in Austria and Germany, since several years, there's an intense fear to lose what has been achieved and attained in the past. So think of the economic crisis in 2008. Back in 2008, much concern started among people about how safe would be their jobs, how safe would be their bank accounts, and so on. In fact, they are perfectly safe still today, but there is fear. And if there is fear, people need or want scapegoats. And asylum seekers are ready scapegoats for the native population because they are the weakest part of the population. And usually the weakest parts of the population are the scapegoats. It is also reasonable to consider educational level. It is reasonable to expect that the better educated will have more positive attitudes and the less well-educated will have worse attitudes toward minorities, and in this case towards asylum seekers. And it could also be speculated that younger people have more positive attitudes and older people would be more suspicious and would have more negative attitudes. On the next slide, we continue with possible individual differences. From the literature, it is known that one cognitive variable predicting negative attitudes towards minorities is perceived economic threat. This is the belief that minorities, and in this case refugees and asylum seekers, will take away jobs, housing facilities, social security resources, and so on. Like a cake, if there are more eaters of a cake of a certain size, if there are more eaters, the pieces of cake will get smaller. So this is the idea behind perceived economic threat, but also perceived cultural threat. The belief that refugees will compromise native culture and native religion. So paradoxically, nowadays people in Germany and Austria are not very religious. They never go to church. But maybe this is the reason why they are so afraid that a mosque could be built. So they are not very well identified with their religion, and usually they are not very well identified with their culture. They are watching American TV movies instead of reading Austrian books. They are not very well identified with their culture. And for this reason, it is plausible to expect that they will project their identity problem again on the weakest part of society, and these are refugees and asylum seekers. So that's perceived cultural threat. The third point is racism, but modern racism. You know, nowadays, you hardly find a person who says, "Oh, I don't like that group, they are bad people." That's quite out of date. Today, it is common to say, "Oh, everybody has the same rights. All humans are equal. I believe in that. I'm not a racist. Everyone deserves to be treated equally, no matter what's the color of his or her skin," and so on. But the belief, they say, we want refugees to be treated equally, of course, but they already get more than our own people. And this is what they don't like. They say they already get more than the poor native Austrians, Germans, and so on, and they should be treated equally, and therefore less should be given to, for example, asylum seekers and refugees. This is called modern racism. The concept has been developed in the USA on the background of the black and white problem. It's just the same there. Many white people say, "Oh, I am no racist. The blacks are perfectly, they are just perfect people like us, and they should be treated exactly the same. But they already get more than white ones, and this is not okay." And this attitude is called modern racism. It's very important to know that and to keep this in mind. And our hypothesis, as I said, this stems from the black and white problem in the US, and we transferred it to the current situation and expected that modern racism also would be the basis of negative attitudes toward asylum seekers and refugees. Part of the basis, of course. We also said that probably people feeling well, who are satisfied with their lives and who are optimistic, that such people will have more positive attitudes toward refugees than the pessimistic part of society. So we hypothesized that life satisfaction is a predictor of positive attitudes, and so would be optimism. And again, modern racism would be a predictor of negative attitudes. This is a structural equation model which we did not yet compute, but we computed stepward regressions, and later on I will report to you the results of the regression analysis. But this model visualizes quite clearly what we expected. On the left hand, we have two latent variables. The upper one is life satisfaction, the lower one is optimism. And we expected that life satisfaction and optimism would predict the three latents in the middle. The upper one is economic threat, the middle one is cultural threat, and the lower one is modern racism. And finally, we expected that these three, so cultural threat, economic threat, and modern racism, these three would predict attitudes toward refugees, and that also schooling and age would contribute to the prediction of attitudes. So again, attitudes toward asylum seekers and refugees will be predicted by cultural and economic threat, modern racism, schooling level, and age. And perceived threat and racism would be predicted by life satisfaction and optimism. In other words, we expected that cultural threat mentality and modern racism would be mediators between life satisfaction and optimism on the one hand, and attitudes toward refugees on the other hand. This is the samples, the three parts of the samples. You see, in Germany, we consulted 198 people, 84 of them female. In Austria, we asked 151 people, 62 of them female. And in Slovakia, we interviewed 307 people, 194 of them female. And these are the age, the descriptive data on the age and schooling. In Germany, the mean age was about 29 years and 13 years of schooling. In Austria, the mean age was 31 years and 12 years of schooling. And the Slovakian sample was a bit older, with 39 years of age and about 14 years of schooling. So you see in the three countries about the same duration of schooling, and the Slovakian sample being slightly older than the other two. In further analysis, we could consider to exclude some older people from the Slovakian sample to get a non-significant age difference between the three parts of the sample. But as we found out later, age does not play an important role as a predictor of attitudes toward refugees. Therefore, the age differences among the three samples do not seem to be important. The next slide shows you the questionnaire in some detail. In fact, this was the questionnaire, only 2 pages. The upper left part is life satisfaction. The lower left part is optimism. The upper right part is cultural and economic threat. And the middle part on the right-hand side is modern racism. And finally, you have the scale between triple plus over 0 to triple minus, the attitude toward refugees and asylum seekers. These are the results. First of all, Slovakia scored significantly more negative as attitudes are concerned than Austria and Germany on this 7-point scale, which range from -3 to +3. Germans reached a mean of 0.73. Austria was somewhat less positive with a mean of +0.52, and Slovakia was more negative with a mean of -0.98. Here again you have the model, which is in this way it is much clearer than the detailed result of the regression, which I will not show because it's a very small print and not needed for this purpose here. Instead, just look at the stars, the asterisks. One star means P it's significant on the 5% level, and 2 stars means significant on the 1% level, and 1 star in brackets means significant only in 1 or 2 of the sample and very little variance explained. So it does not, in this case, not indicate a statistical trend, but in this case, as I said, it means that only very little variance was explained and it was not significant in all of the samples. To give you a short summary, this will suffice. So you see at a glance that there are very strong relationships between economic and perceived economic and cultural threat on the one hand, and attitudes toward refugees and asylum seekers on the other. And you also see that modern racism is a significant predictor of attitudes. But schooling and age is not. Surprisingly, schooling and age does not play a big part in some of the three, in part of the 3 samples. You have slightly significant passes, but the 2 socio-demographic variables, years of schooling and age, play only a minor part as compared to the cognitive variables in the middle of the model. We also found, against our predictions, that life satisfaction and optimism are no strong predictors of perceived threat and modern racism. There are slightly significant passes in 1 or 2 of the samples, but results are inconsistent, and if the passes are significant, still they explain only very, very small amounts of variance. So, in short, results indicate that attitudes toward refugees in the first place are predicted by cognitive factors, by the belief that refugees will take away pieces of our social system cake, by the belief that they will endanger our culture and religion, and by modern racism. So by those 3 cognitive variables, attitudes are predicted quite strongly, but they are not predicted strongly by years of schooling and age. This is an interesting result. To summarize, in Slovakia, attitudes were more negative than in Austria and Germany. It should be noted, however, that the purpose of the study was not a social survey. The purpose was not, in the first place, to find out whether attitudes are more or less negative in Austria, Germany, or Slovakia. This is not the intention of the study. The intention of the study was to find out by which variables attitudes can be predicted. So this is the important thing. And in all three samples we found, as I just said, that perceived cultural and economic threat and modern racism are the strongest predictors of the negative attitudes. And schooling and age play only a minor part in all three samples. And in all three samples, life satisfaction and optimism are very poor predictors of cultural and economic threat and modern racism. So the important part of the results are not the differences between the three countries, but the similarities. In all three countries, it was the same. Cultural and economic threat and modern racism are the strongest predictors of attitudes toward refugees and asylum seekers. Therefore, life satisfaction and optimism, as well as socio-demographic structural differences within a country, usually are overestimated as predictors. It's lay people's belief that younger people and better educated people will have the more positive attitudes. So this was not supported. But cognitive factors, especially perceived threat, we call it zero-sum thinking. The belief that refugees would take away something of cultural and economic resources. And of course modern racism. These are the strongest predictors of positive or negative attitudes toward refugees. People believe that, of course not all people, but those with negative attitudes believe that this development would lead to disadvantages to the native population in the fields of the social system and the cultural establishment. Therefore, the results tell us if we want to change attitudes toward refugees, asylum seekers, and possibly also disadvantaged minorities, we have to take these results into account. And first we have to change this kind of zero-sum thinking. If more people come here, they will get more of the cake, and so our pieces of the cake will be smaller. This is called zero-sum thinking, which is quite naive, because if people come here and, for example, population increases by about 10%, especially with young people and children, this will mean that in the decades to come, there will be more people working, more young people working, more young people paying taxes, more people contributing to our pensions and so on. And in 10 years, these people coming here now, they will be payers to the social system and not receivers anymore. So zero-sum thinking is perfectly logic for pieces of cake, but it is not logic for the social system, and it is not logic for economic considerations of a whole country. So these are the findings and also discussion of study number 1. Now we will continue with study number 2, which was about self-help groups of Chechen asylum seekers and refugees and their health-related effects. Till 2012, Chechens were among the most frequent groups of asylum seekers and refugees in Austria till 2012. Chechnya is an area in the south of the Russian Federation, so Chechens are Russian citizens. You see it here on the map. It's between the Caspian and the Black Sea located. This is Grozny at the time of our study, Chechnya's capital. And again Grozny and pictures from Chechnya. The civilian population was threatened both by the Russian government and by Chechen resistance fighters, a very, very difficult to understand situation. Detentions, torture, kidnappings happened daily, and every year up to 400 persons just disappeared sources said that 49 common graves with 3,000 dead people were reported officially from Chechnya. And according to one of our own studies from 2006, approximately 50% of Chechens in Austria show post-traumatic symptoms, at least. Talking about collectivism and individualism, here you have the Chechen extended family. In Chechnya, migration led to the destruction of such social networks, because you can imagine easily that a whole extended family comprising 20 people cannot be transferred from Chechnya to Austria with very limited financial means. Therefore, members of collectivistic societies are especially affected by the disruption of families. Just remember Eisenhoch's saying of cultural bereavement. By separation from the extended family, of course, also the systems of social support have been disrupted, and therefore our idea was to prepare culturally specific group interventions, which were considered helpful instead of or in addition to conventional psychotherapy. And we considered that Chechen refugees might benefit from a group-based, resource-oriented and culturally specific self-help approach. So we installed guided self-help groups and expected them to be at least equally effective as interpreter-assisted conventional behavior therapy. We compared self-help groups with cognitive behavior therapy, CBT, and with EMDR, which is a well-established short intervention for post-traumatic stress disorder. And we compared all these three, of course, with a waitlist control group. In the first early phase of the study, we prepared 4 Chechen laypeople, 2 men and 2 women, and trained them as group leaders. There were 10 workshops comprising 15 units each, with guest lecturers, even from the USA, of internationally renowned experts. Yes, Mr. Anthony Marcella from Hawaii was one of the guest lecturers, a very, very well-known expert in transcultural psychiatry and psychology. The total sample comprised 94 adult Chechens, which were randomized, as I said, to the self-help condition, to the CBT condition, to the EMDR condition, and to the waitlist condition. We had separate groups for females and males according to Chechen tradition. Here you have the time plan. Again, the 2 self-help groups on the top, the 2 waitlist groups, the 2 CBT groups, and the EMDR condition, with the black lines indicating the times of measurement. So we measured before and after the interventions, and there is 3 and 6 time follow-up. These were the measures: the Hopkins symptom checklist measuring anxiety and depression, the HTQ measuring post-traumatic symptoms, and the post-traumatic growth inventory. We've examined the first 2 instruments in a previous study and found out that they were reasonably usable with non-European and non-US populations, especially with Chechen people. So they can be considered reliable and valid in their Russian translation. Now the results, shortly summarized. The self-help groups and the CBT groups were found to be significantly superior to waitlist and EMDR. And in fact, the self-help groups were highly effective in reducing the post-traumatic symptoms. You have an effect size of 0.94 and of 0.4 post-traumatic symptoms, and of 0.62 for anxiety and depression. This is Cohen's D. It's the difference between the experimental group and the control group. And an effect size of 1 means that measurements before and after the intervention differed by 1 standard deviation. So 0.94 means the difference before and after were 0.94 standard deviations in the experimental group as compared to the control group. If you compare this to meta-analysis about the effectiveness of various psychotherapeutic interventions, for example, the old study by Smith, Glass and Miller from the 70s, or the Grave study at 1997 or something like that. If you compare these effect sizes to these large meta-analyses, you see that the self-help groups have been equally effective as many psychotherapeutic approaches. In the current study, we also found out that self-help and CBT did not differ significantly from each other. This is an important finding because CBT is known to be one of the best one of the best interventions, and which is known to be one of the most effective types of psychotherapy, especially for post-traumatic symptoms. And so is EMDR. But EMDR did not work at all with this group of people. It may be speculated that the reason is that EMDR works with imagining the traumatic situation. But these people were multiply traumatized, so what should they imagine? So this is type 2 trauma, with chronic traumatization over a long period of time, and it may be speculated that for this reason EMDR did not work. Or of course, you never know, maybe our EMDR therapies did not work effectively. We cannot clarify this. But as I said, self-help and CBT did not differ significantly from each other with respect to their effectiveness. EMDR did not work at all. And it should also be said that none of the interventions led to so-called post-traumatic growth, which may be an entirely Western concept as modeled in the USA some decades ago. So post-traumatic growth was not found in our asylum seekers or refugees center. So these are the results of the study. Visualize some examples. You see the blue line is self-help, the green line is CBT, the yellow line is waitlist, and the pink line is EMDR. Here for anxiety and depression is measured by the HSCL25, and quite clearly you see the interaction here in the graph from ANOVA. Here it's the same for trauma symptoms HTQ, a clear significant effect, clear interaction between the waitlist and self-help. And you also see quite well that self-help and CBT lines are perfectly parallel. So you see self-help worked as well as CBT did, but no effect for post-traumatic growth, as I said. The control group was a waitlist control group, so they got their intervention 3 months later, and we found similar improvements also in this second trial. It's also important to note that at the 3 and 6 months follow-ups, improvements were still there, and still post-traumatic growth was not found. Some additional qualitative results which might be of interest. In the self-help groups, the participants expressed more negative feelings than in the therapy group, which can be easily understood because in the self-help group they were not talking to Austrians and an Austrian interpreter, but they were within their ethnic community, and of course for this reason they felt freer to express also negative feelings, which of course is one of the purposes of such interventions. They should express negative feelings if negative feelings are there. In the CBT groups, the clients try to express their thanks and their respect for the therapists. In the self-help groups, especially women could express their feelings of depression, hopelessness, nervousness and irritation more clearly, more openly. And it was also clear that the group interventions were clearly preferred to one-on-one interventions. The clients said that it was extremely helpful to speak their own language in the self-help groups. What do we learn from this? Guided self-help groups have proved to be highly effective in helping Chechen refugees with symptoms of post-traumatic stress. Guided self-help groups pose a promising culturally sensitive alternative to conventional psychotherapy, also considering financial limitations. It should be considered, the differential indication of self-help versus professional psychotherapy should be developed more clearly. And we also learned that post-traumatic growth is a Western concept which obviously does not make sense in other cultures and quite obviously did not make sense with our sample. So let's have a look also on the second type of social support for asylum seekers and refugees. In this case, social support by sponsorships, especial regard to the health-related effects. Even if asylum is granted, as I mentioned in the morning, acculturation is a stressful experience for refugees, and we called this acculturative stress. So this study did not address asylum seekers living at asylum homes. This study addressed refugees who already settled down in society, who had been granted asylum, who knew that they would be allowed to stay in Austria for a lifetime, and who faced the challenge of acculturation now in the narrow sense. In Barry's model of acculturative stress, as you saw in the morning, social support is one of the most important moderating factors on psychological and societal adaptation. So we examined the effects of sponsorships by Austrian adults from Austrian adults for adults from Chechnya and Afghanistan over a defined period of 6 months. It could be either single persons or families, both on the sponsor and on the client side. Before we started with the study, of course, we had to apply for the funding by the Austrian Funding Association, and in that preparatory phase, we collected previous anecdotal reports about sponsorships all over the world, refugee sponsorships all over the world. And these reports were mostly positive, but there was no scientific evidence available about the health-related effects of such interventions. So it was not really scientific literature, it was rather like the social worker's report about his or her findings and successes with certain groups of clients, but there never a controlled study had been done in order to examine the effects of sponsorships more closely. And this was the reason why we did this randomized controlled study, which was, just like the self-help project, financed by the Austrian Science Fund over 2 years. This was the course of the study as we planned it in advance. It's similar to the first design. we have 2 intervention groups and 2 waitlist control groups. In this case, of course, not men and women, but in this case we have Chechens and Afghans in the first group, and again Chechen and Afghans in the second group. These were our hypotheses which were drawn from Perry's model of acculturative stress. We expected social support by sponsorships to be effective with respect to enhancing both psychological and sociocultural adaptation. The intervention group was expected to improve significantly as compared to the waitlist control group on a number of questionnaires assessing psychological and sociocultural adaptation. We recruited 36 sponsors, 25 of them female, with the help of local TV and newspapers. And again, like before, but a bit shorter, we prepared the sponsors for their work in one-day workshops. First, conveying general information on refugees and asylum seekers, things like you learned today in the morning. Second, developmental psychology and problems at school. Third, trauma and coping with trauma. And 4, previous international experience with sponsorships for refugees. Surprisingly, sponsors were quite easy to recruit, but the opposite was the case for the refugee participants. Many were reluctant to accept this. This can be easily explained from their collectivistic culture. In collectivist culture, it is very unusual that strangers help strangers. Helping strangers is typical for individualist society. In individualist society, you even give money to welfare organizations, which is a very, very abstract construction. And this is quite normal. You also give money or other help to a person with whom you have pity, no matter if you know that person personally or not. In collectivist society, this is extremely unusual. In collectivist society, it is quite normal to help their own extended family, which is not the case in individualist society. Individualist society has old people's homes and so on for their grandparents because they have no time to attend to them because they must go to work. This would be unthinkable in collectivist society. So in sum, both types of cultures are equally empathetic with poor people, but they differ with respect to their readiness to assist people whom they do not know. And therefore, our refugees, many of them were quite surprised about the willingness of sponsors, and they even suspected hidden motives and so on. But finally, we not only found sponsors, but we also found clients who accepted them as their sponsors, mostly families, and could start with these 6 months coachings, step by step. So finally, we had recruited 68 Chechen and Afghan refugees, 29 of them women and 39 men, with a mean age of 33 years. The sponsors were free in their way in which they conducted their sponsorships, for example, with respect to the frequency of contacts, places where they met, etc. In most cases, they assisted children or also adults in learning German, helped the children doing their homework, or assisted in finding work or housing, or in dealing with local authorities. Interestingly, there were little language difficulties because mostly refugees had a basic knowledge of German. but the sponsors did not speak Farsi or Russian or Chechen, of course. The sponsors were supervised on a monthly basis at the psychology department of Innsbruck University by a colleague of mine and me. And at this occasion also qualitative data were collected from the sponsors. These were the results of qualitative evaluation. We did phone interviews with the clients by native speakers, and we did group discussions with the sponsors, as I just mentioned, during supervision. Among the clients initially there was much optimism, and the sponsors were in the role of so-called parents with very high expectations. Later there was some disappointment, as many problems had remained unchanged. Often the clients were suspicious because of the voluntary engagement by strangers, as I already said, which is uncommon in collectivist culture. And not surprisingly, Muslim men did not accept young women as sponsors. So all that had to be considered. In the sponsors' view, in 50 cases, their interventions were successful. In 8 cases, they were rated as unsuccessful. In 2 cases, sponsorships were broken off after a short period of time. And in 2 cases, the sponsorship ended because the sponsors got ill or had an accident. These were the measures of our quantitative variables. We used the problem checklist, for example, the Bradford somatic inventory, again the Hopkins symptom checklist, again the HDQ, a simple measure of self-esteem and of life satisfaction. It was the same we used in the current study. We measured various psychological problems, social contact, perceived social support, perceived discrimination, and coping strategies. All these measures had been used previously by international researchers in the field of acculturation of migrants and refugees, so that there was no question about the usability of these questionnaires in the current context. Now let's go to the result. First of all, in the total sample, results were disappointing. There was no significant interaction in the analysis of variance. But when we took a closer look on the data and included only people with a high score on the HDQ, which is to say only traumatized participants, we got very interesting and encouraging significant results. In the traumatized part of the sample, there was significantly more improvement in the intervention group as compared to the waiting group with regard to somatic complaints, anxiety and depression, post-traumatic symptoms, other psychological problems, contact to compatriots and perceived social support, but not for everyday problems, self-esteem, life satisfaction, contact to Austrians, perceived discrimination and coping strategies. So, in fact, somewhat surprisingly but interestingly, to summarize this in a simple way, it could be said that sponsorships rather worked like psychotherapy and not like social work. So you see, the clients improved with respect to their symptoms and their well-being, but it did not improve in practical things. Which in fact is not surprising, because 6 months are a very short period of time to achieve practical changes, for example with housing, discrimination and other everyday problems. But 6 months can suffice to change, to achieve stable changes of clinical symptomatology and well-being. Of course, this is possible. Consider CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, which usually is a short intervention, taking 2 or 3 months and not longer. So of course change can be brought about. It's quite an interesting result. So 2 examples, a positive example with the interactions. You see the somatic complaints. In the traumatized part of the sample, you have a large interaction, a clear interaction and a large effect size. You see Cohen's D 1.3 standard deviations difference between experimental group and waiting group. And on the other hand, the non-traumatized did not benefit. Negative example, contact to Austrians, neither the traumatized nor the non-traumatized benefited from the intervention to a serious degree. You see there is no significant difference with respect to contact to the Austrian native population. To summarize this, on average, sponsors have a more favorable view of the effects than their clients. So it was easier to find sponsors than clients, which can be easily explained not only by the differences between individualist and collectivist societies, but also by the fact that providing social support enhances self-esteem. This is one of the reasons why people give money to charities, because it enhances their self-esteem. As social psychologists, you are certainly aware of this fact. But on the other hand, social support may threaten the self-esteem of the person receiving it. And therefore many clients have difficulties to accept it. Interestingly, as I said, sponsorships were only helpful for traumatized clients. And to summarize the effect, I said before, psychotherapy, yes, social work, no. To put it in a more intellectual way, you also can say the effects were palliative rather than instrumental. It's just the same thing in somewhat scientific words. In other words, we found increased well-being and decrease of clinical symptoms, but no changes in the objective life situation, which again can be explained by the relatively short duration of the sponsorships of only 6 months. The interaction between post-traumatic and acculturative stress should receive more attention. So interestingly, obviously the non-traumatized part of the sample did not need the sponsorships. The non-traumatized part of the sample obviously were able to deal with their everyday situation on their own. There was no effect for the non-traumatized part, but there were large effects in the traumatized part. So this should be considered in the future when similar interventions are offered, for example, by charities. We found that sponsorships had a palliative rather than instrumental effect, and this may be cautiously generalized to the effects of social support in general. Future sponsorship projects should have their focus on increasing well-being of traumatized individuals and reducing their clinical symptomatology. And of course, they should also account for an optimal match of sponsors and clients. We found this from our discussions with the sponsors and from the details of our qualitative results. Ladies and gentlemen, I wanted to keep it short, so this is the end of part 2.